All right, so hello, I'm here with Chris Meacham. Chris, for those who don't know who you are, who are you?
Um, I'm a professor in the philosophy department at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Uh, and I mostly work in sort of philosophy of physics and Bayesian decision theory. Uh, yeah.
Nice. As those of you who have been, following, who have watched other videos know, I often, I have lots of things to say about Anthropics, and I've expressed support for SIA, but I'm just an undergrad. These are complicated issues, so I thought worth having on someone who's informed when it comes to Anthropics and seeing what they think. So I guess I'll ask you so I know in your work, a lot of your work has been about different ways of different updating rules as applied to anthropic reasoning. But sort of in broad strokes, what broadly do you think about anthropics? Do you have a preferred anthropic theory? Give us sort of the basic rundown of your views broadly.
Sure. So I should say, as a sort of preliminary, although a lot of my published work has been adjacent to Anthropics, I haven't done a ton of work on it itself. I guess I have this forthcoming paper, which I think is the first paper I've actually written, which is on one of these kinds of topics. So just to project the appropriate level of expertise to expect me to have, I want to say that to be so honest about this. Okay, so yeah. Sorry. So there's a bunch of things going on here to my mind. So you mentioned the SIA, or the I take it that's the self-indication assumption that Bostrom talks about.
Yeah.
So to take that first, so here's why I'm not eager to say I endorse the self-indication assumption, is I really don't know what it means. And I don't mean that in a, rather, it seems to me that people in the literature use it in different ways. And there's equivocation going on sometimes. Actually, when you mentioned talking about SIA and Anthropics, I wanted to look up the sort of characterization that Bostrom gives. I think that's, given the fact that you exist, you should, other things equal, favor hypotheses according to which many observers exist over hypotheses in which few observers exist. So that's okay. So I certainly get the intuitive vibe there. But then when it gets down to very specifics, it's not clear to me what's supposed to count as an instance of the view and what's not. And I feel like this actually comes up, raises some problems in literature. So, but here's a couple of the salient questions that come to mind. So, let's say for a second, and this itself is a contentious thing, that we're understanding this as a constraint on something like your priors. So priors, say, understood as something like the credences you ought to have if you were to have no evidence whatsoever. The credences are prior to or screening off all of your evidence, something like that. So you might take this to be a constraint on what your prior should be like. So prior to evidence, whatever, you should assign more credence to possibilities with more observers than possibilities with fewer observers. Okay. So say I have a view, and there's two possibilities, one with two observers and one with one observer. And the view says my credence in the possibility with two observers should be 1.000001 times more than my credence in the possibility with one observer. So do I qualify as somebody who is endorsing the self-indicating assumption?
Wait, sorry, I missed exactly. Sorry, did you say you regard it as twice as likely that you're one of the two observers?
No. There's two possibilities you're entertaining, or we're considering prior to evidence. We're looking at our priors. One possibility has one observer. One possibility has two observers. And here's my rule, and I want to know if my rule qualifies as an instance of the self-indicating assumption. Your credence in the possibility with two observers should be 1.00000
Oh, yeah.
greater.
Yeah.
Then you're creating
So,
the possibility with one observer.
right. So whether it counts as an instance of SIA, that like it just depends on exactly how you're defining SIA. But I agree that view is very much like not in the spirit of most of the people who endorse SIA. And I think for that reason, I don't think Bostrom defined it very well. Where I think because I think his definition, leaves open the possibility that a view with slightly more observers would end up counting as SIA. Sorry, that says that a theory with way more observers should have a slightly higher probability. Where with the standard SIA line is that you should think that that a theory on which there are two observers, all else equal, is twice as likely as a theory on which there's one observer. So yeah. I guess I can describe how there's a definition of SIA that I've given that I think sort of captures the spirit. It's a bit of a mouthful. So the idea is that when assessing the SIA is the idea that the relative probability of you being each of two time slices does not depend on the presence of other time slices. Okay, and I know that it doesn't sound like that's what SIA is, but so the idea is, right. So think about this case where let's say a coin gets flipped. If it comes up heads, one person gets created. If it comes up tails, two people get created. Well, on a view, so let's give each of the people names. Let's say heads means A gets created, tails means B and C get created. So I get created. I don't know if I'm A or B or C. Well, now imagine if tails only created B. Well, then clearly I should think that heads and tails were equally likely. Similarly, if tails only created C, then I should think that heads and tails were equally likely. And so if you, when assessing the relative probability that you're A versus B, ignore the presence of C, and when assessing the relative probability that you're, C and A, ignore the presence of B, then you'll end up getting a credence twice as high in the coin having come up tails. So that's sort of the spirit where it's like, as long as you think that when you're assessing the relative probability of each of two time slices, of you being each of two time slices, you ignore the other time slices, then just by sort of like indifference reasoning, you'll get an update by a factor of n on a theory on which there are n times as many people that you might presently be. It's about time slices rather than people, but the same basic point will apply to time slices. I should also say briefly that I think it's wrong to define it as part of your prior. The way I think about it, you're sort of updating from the fact that you exist, and this is what the update's from, right? So it's not like, there's nothing about a theory on which there are more people that makes it likelier inherently to be true. It's just that a theory on which there are more people that exist is likelier to have me, would be the sort of spirit.
Yeah, good. Sorry. So that's already helpful, right? I feel some people who talk about the self-indicating assumption do seem to be making claims about priors. And then there's that coupled with certain ways of updating. And so there could be a difference. There could be cases where you think, oh, initially, in some sense, maybe you should have priors that are like this. Again, sounds like not the view you're endorsing. But through certain kinds of dynamical processes, you can end up in situations that are not like that. So for example, the following is compatible. You could pair something which looks like self-indicating assumption, or call it, prior self-indicating assumption, with a way of updating self-locating beliefs that, say, requires you to be a halfer in a fission version of the Sleeping Beauty case. So those are all compatible. Some people understand or talk about self-indicating assumption and assume that maybe it's at all times or all situations in which you're in. So since in the fission version of the Sleeping Beauty case, you wake up and you have one possibility, one world with two observers and the other with one observer, at least after you conditionalize on your evidence, that you should take the one with two observers to be twice as likely or something like that. So that's another angle. This question about whether we take this to be a principle which is applying to sort of priors, or a principle we take to applying to sort of any sort of epistemic state somebody might end up in. It sounds like maybe the latter is the kind of way you're thinking about it.
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
Um,
good. So one of the things, and I'm wondering whether this is speaking to sort of the relative probability, how we're understanding relative probability as you were talking about it. So one of the things in the Bostrom formulation is he has the all other things being equal clause. Uh, and so that's another thing that I worry about a lot because that packs in potentially a lot. Packs in some potentially big disagreements. Uh, so let's say we buy some sort of a standard chance credence principle. So we buy as a constraint in rationality that your beliefs about the chances should tie to your beliefs in some principled way. So like Lewis's principle would be a sort of canonical example of a chance credence principle. It's natural, if we adopt that sort of approach, to see the principle as imposing a constraint on what your priors are like. So Lewis talks about constraints on a reasonable initial credence function. So this would be a constraint on what your priors are like. Now, if we think there are other constraints on what your priors are like, there's a question about how these two things play with each other. So one sort of thought is, for example, your priors, the constraints on priors imposed by the principle trump any constraints imposed by something like a self-indicating assumption understood in an priori way. Or you may take the self-indicating assumption and priori constraints to trump the chance ones, or maybe there's some sort of complicated way in which they mix. So spelling out the all else equals, like that's one of the many things that we need to spell out for the all else equals clause to determine, like exactly how does this play with the other kinds of constraints we have. Like if we have chances of a certain kind, does that mean that all else is equal isn't, or all else isn't equal? Is that something
yeah, I think that's a worry about Bostrom's definition, where right, because yes, right, defining exactly what is meant by all else equal, both you get vagaries there, and it also doesn't seem to capture the spirit of SIA, where like SIA, it's not really like when you talk about the like presumptuous philosopher results, for example, it's not just like, well, all else equal, it likes theories on which there are more people. I feel like that undersells it. It's that it really likes theories on which there are more people. The amount that it likes theories is proportional to the number of people, such that even a theory with ridiculously low prior would beat out it that predicts infinite people existing, just automatically beats out any theory that says that there are finite numbers of people. You raised a question about exactly what's meant by the relative probability. I mean, I guess what I meant by the relative probability is just, like the probability, if the relative probability of A and B is like the probability of A divided by the probability of B or something, where like you're trying to figure out the odds ratio between A and B. So you're trying to figure out like the probability ratio between them rather than what values they actually in fact take on. So it's perfectly fine for the third event to take up some of the probability space so that the other ones go down in probability, but the ratio between them shouldn't change from the presence of more people.
Okay, and sorry, and I know you said that mouthful relatively quickly. So some of these are just questions sort of fleshing that out, or I'm sure could well have been formulated what you said, and it's just me sort of asking questions to sort of remember or understand parts of it. On your understanding, is there anything about, so like the time slices, which it have, or maybe centers? It sounds like sort of like centered worlds is the kind of thing you have maybe in mind by time slices. And to use another bit of terminology that sometimes is used in literature, does it matter whether are we taking those time slices to be located at the same world? Is that one of the?
They don't have to be located at the same world. This principle will, I think it'll apply whether they're located at the same world or not. So like in the Sleeping Beauty case, in the I think you described it as the fission Sleeping Beauty case, where tails means two people get created. So in that case, it commits you to thinking that the odds that you're the first person who gets created and the coin came up heads equals the odds that you're the first person who get created and the coin came up tails, because when assessing the relative probability that you're the first person on heads versus tails, you're supposed to ignore the second person.
Okay, and so the chance of heads or tails, is that going to be relevant here? So let's say heads, it's heavily weighted towards heads. The chance of heads is 0.9. The chance of tails,
right? So it will be relevant. The idea is just that when you're assessing, the idea is just the way you figure out the probabilities of the different worlds is you start by doing sort of like a pairwise comparison between any two people to figure out the relative probabilities of you being each of them. And then from there you get the probabilities, and then you distribute your credence across the relative credences that you got from that. So for example, let's imagine you roll a die, and if the die comes up 6, you create 2 people, and if it comes up 1 through 5, you create 1 person. You'll end up thinking, I think, that the odds the die came up 6 has 2/7 probability, because, or wait, is it 2/6? I don't know. I'd have to work out the math on a piece of paper. But the idea is you would first look at the probability that you're the first person who gets created by the 6 die roll versus that you're one of the 5 people who gets created by the that you're the 1 person who gets created by the 1 through 5 die roll. So then I think you'd say if there was just 1 person who got created by the 6 die roll, then then it would just have 1 and the odds you'd be that person would be 1 in 6. And so now there are 2 people, and they each get for each of them are such that the relative odds, each of the 2 people who are created by the 6 die roll are such that the odds that you're each of them is 1/6 the odds that you're one of the 5 people. That you're the 1 person who gets created by die rolls 1 through 5, and then you just split your credence up across. And then you just do the math of, okay, so exactly how does that work out? And I think maybe it works out to 2/7, but it may work out to something weirder. And but yeah. So that's the basic picture, where you start by figuring out the relative probabilities, and then you just renormalize.
Good. Sorry. So let me re-describe that back to you, just to make sure that I have it in mind. And I think I do. So we have some initial way of, say, assigning credences or priors over worlds. Then we sort of multiply that factor by the number of observers at each world. And then we renormalize our values, so they all add up to 1.
Yeah, that would be basically the procedure. There's a little bit of complexity in that it's not enough. So like, it'll depend on exactly what you're updating on and when, because you don't want to say that, like, so suppose a coin gets flipped. If it comes up heads, 1 copy of me is created. And if it comes up tails, 1 copy of me is created and 1 copy of Abraham Lincoln is created. SIA will give no reason to prefer tails over heads. Because what matters is the relative probabilities of the people. So given that I know that I'm not Abe Lincoln, the relative, there's only 1 person who I might be on both heads and tails, and they start with an equal prior. And so then I just, end up splitting it both ways. But right, that's the basic procedure, that just, like the way I sometimes put it crudely when I'm explaining the idea to people is a theory that says that there are X times as many people makes your present existence X times as likely. Now, we have to add it to be about time slices, and you have to make that more precise. But that's sort of like the core idea behind SIA. The other thing I should say is that, so there are some puzzles about exactly how to formulate it. But like, there are some ideas where you can be confident that something in the vicinity of them is right, even if the precise way of formalizing them mathematically is slightly elusive. So even if it turned out that like the precise way of formulating SIA was a bit elusive, it could still be that we have good reason for thinking that coin gets flipped. If it comes up heads, one person's created. If it comes up tails, 10 people get created. You should think tails are 10 times as likely as heads if you get created from this process.
Yeah, sorry. And that's fair. I mean, people have different sensibilities. Some people are more comfortable than others with, like, for example, formulating things with all else being equal clauses. And, I'm one of those people who, generally don't find that sort of thing in my papers because given my philosophical sensibility, it's like, oh, I find that extraordinarily painful. But I have lots of colleagues who do excellent work who do. So I'm not casting shade on that.
You find it painful, all else equal.
Yeah, as far as the rough idea, that's certainly true. Here's one of the reasons why this is an active worry for me versus, I think, a nitpicky worry, is I feel like there's actual places where heavy stuff ends up being depending on this. So like Isaacs, Hawthorne, and Russell have this recent paper where one of the things they do is they give what they suggest is one sort of precise formulation of self-indicating assumption. And then have sort of the response where, among other things, I say, well, here's this plausible alternative view, which in at least some ways looks a lot like a self-indicating assumption, but gives completely different results with respect to the question they're looking at, which is whether fine-tuning evidence conforms multiverse. So if it were the case that all the ways of filling in these details all pretty much just gave the same answer in all the relevant cases, then I wouldn't be nearly as worried about it. My worry is that I think that's actually not the case. I feel like, these actually details, which depending on how you fill them in, can actually lead to big differences on some of the key questions people are asking. So just, that's where I'm coming from. I'm not trying to be nitpicky or.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think that, on this view, it will favor multiverse, right? You'll want, because, for the reasons I described, where like, if you have a theory that says there are more people that you might presently be, which you will under a multiverse view, then you'll like, have it in total more, you'll have more credence in those theories. But yeah, so I guess, what do you make of the formalization of just saying, look, the relative probabilities that you're each of two people doesn't depend on the presence of other people?
Yeah, good, right. And I think even in the Lincoln example you gave, that the sort of reformulation that I just described, and I'm just saying that because I was describing it in a way like, okay, here's the way which is easy for me to think in terms of. I think that ends up being the same as yours, just among other things, you're conditionalizing on your actual evidence. Your evidence rules out you being Lincoln, for example, in your example. And so if your initial prior ends up being twice as great in the possibility with Lincoln and, a subject in a subjective state like yours versus a world with just a subjective state like yours. But then when you update on your phenomenal evidence, you eliminate the Lincoln possibility, you'll go back to, say, having an equal credence in each of those two possibilities, which sounds like the position you want to end up endorsing.
Yeah, I think that's right. Sorry, give me 1 second. I can still hear you, but I just. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. Yeah, right. So I think that's correct.
Yeah. So here's what my inclination is to think about sort of anthropic principles kind of stuff. So this isn't something I have a super firm view on, but my inclination is to be relatively permissivist about those kinds of things. So I mentioned like what sorts of rational constraints do I think are there on priors? Or are there on sort of rational belief? And I think there are various kinds. There's like the sort of structural ones that conditionalization imposes. So there's something like probabilism, maybe. Your credences should satisfy the probability axioms. There's conditionalization, which is maybe that your credence should update in a certain way. Or and we get the context of self-locating beliefs, okay, maybe we're gonna need to say something a bit different, but some replacement of that has to do with evidence and what your credence should be. And then there'll be some sort of certain auxiliary norms like the principle, or a chance credence principle of some kind. So I guess one sort of question is one going to accept a further principled constraint that has to do with, say, the number of observers at different possibilities? And so I'm prima facie inclined to be permissive about that. So in the sort of cases you're describing, I'd be inclined to say, well, it's permissible to have the surprise you're describing, but not obligatory.
Okay, that's interesting. I'll register that there does seem to be something a bit suspicious about like thinking that that the way to do anthropic reasoning doesn't like nail down an answer in, say, the Sleeping Beauty problem, that both answers are permissible, or that, and you can have even more dramatic cases where basically like you can have it be the case that like the SIA answer will give you a credence of roughly 1, and then the other one will give you a credence of roughly 0, and then these are both permissible. But so I suppose then the question will just be, are there arguments for accepting SIA's credences that follow from like sufficiently plausible principles that you're not permitted to reject them? And
I should say it's funny so you say that, because I guess I'm inclined to go the other way. So I'm inclined to think that it's natural or easy to separate anthropic reasoning principle constraints on priors that, say, reflect anthropic biases or anthropic desiderata from self-locating belief stuff. So in part, so I'm a very indecisive kind of person, but so I'm like, there's sort of two ways of approaching self-locating beliefs that fit with very different big picture ways of thinking about epistemic rationality that I'm sort of equally attracted to. And I've defended them both in print in different places. So I'm even in print, I'm indecisive. But let's take one of them, which is sort of a very sort of diachronically serious way of treating these beliefs. And so this is a view that I've called sort of predecessor conditionalization, and Wolfgang Schwartz has defended that same view. He's called it shifted conditionalization. If you adopt that view, then pretty straightforwardly, in a fission version of the Sleeping Beauty case, you're going to be a halfer. But that diachronic rule, the rule says, hey, given these sort of prior credences, you should update in this very particular way, is completely orthogonal to what constraints, if any, you think there are on priors. So it's completely compatible with this updating rule to say your prior should satisfy the principle, and maybe should or maybe shouldn't satisfy any sort of, shouldn't include any anthropic information, right? Anthropic biases.
Right. Okay. So I guess so the way I think about SIA is it's not about the prior, it's about you updating from the fact that you exist. And so then if that's right, well, the right prior in Sleeping Beauty, barring the self-locating stuff of the coin coming up heads, is obviously 0.5. And so then the question is just, is there a required updating rule where you end up thinking that tails is twice as likely as heads? So, okay, I can describe sort of one kind of motivation for this view. So, think about a case like the Sleeping Beauty problem. Let's say one person's created, and then a coin gets flipped. And if it comes up heads, no other people get created. And if it comes up tails, 1,000 other people get created. So you get created, and you don't know your birth rank. So you don't know if you're the first person, the second person, etc. And then you're told, actually, you're the first guy. Well, on SIA, the way it works out is before learning you're the first person, you should have thought that tails was 1,000 times likelier than heads. Conditional on tails, the odds of you being the first person are 1 in 1,000. Conditional on heads, they're 100%. And so then you're back to thinking with 50% odds that the fair coin that hasn't been flipped yet will come up heads. And there's a plausible principle which says that if there's a chancy event that will happen in the future, and basically like nothing, the only things that will turn out differently, depending on how it turns out, will be in the future, right? So it's not like nothing about the world is like right now is likely on the assumption it'll turn out one way. Then your credence in it turning out some way should just equal the objective probability of it turning out that way. So for example, if a coin's going to be flipped later and if it comes up heads, a city will be destroyed. Because you have no evidence about whether the city will be destroyed in the future, then you should think that there's a 50% chance that it'll come up heads.
Do you think, by the way, that the future past stuff matters there?
I don't think that the future past stuff ultimately matters. I think really it's a principle about evidence, which is just absent evidence, your credence should equal, in an event should equal its objective probability. One way in which you could, like one thing that rules out you having evidence is if the only difference between it turning out, between the ways it might turn out, will be in the future, because then by definition, nothing about the world can be such that it's likely on the assumption that it'll turn out. But it'll also apply to other cases that you don't have evidence. So like, for example, suppose a coin's going to get flipped. And if the coin is going to come up heads, 1,000,000 years ago, 10 galaxies away, someone lit a bonfire. Well, then your credence should still be 50-50 because you don't know whether they lit the bonfire. So I think there will be a slightly broader principle that this will fall from. But so this is just a sort of abbreviated version of the principle. But okay, so suppose we grant this principle, but we're not on board with SIA. Well, before we learn that we're the first person, then you should think heads and tails are equally likely. But the odds that you'd be the first person, given that the coin comes up heads, is 100%. While given that it comes up tails, it's 1 in 1,000. So now you end up getting this very strange result where you end up thinking at 1,000 to 1 odds that a fair coin that hasn't been flipped yet will come up heads. You can change around the numbers so that you can be arbitrarily confident that you'll get 100 royal flushes in a row. And this seems very bad. And this follows if you obey this kind of Bayesian conditionalization, where you think that after learning you're the first person, your credence in heads goes up by a factor of 1,000. Now, if you reject it, I think there are some other similarly problematic consequences that are quite similar. So there are many ways to go in response. But so I guess rather than addressing them all, I'd be curious to hear what you make of that kind of argument.
Yeah, right. So I mean, in the self-locating belief sort of context, I think every possible view has verdicts that are implausible or are prima facie implausible in one place or another. So in the version you're describing, where and if I'm understanding it correctly, it's basically a version of Sleeping Beauty or fission Sleeping Beauty. I assume it doesn't matter. I'm assuming you're thinking it doesn't matter. Sorry, it might matter for certain kinds of views.
Yeah, I was imagining a version of Fission Sleeping Beauty, but I think you can get the same point about.
Oh, good. No, let's stick with the fission version. That's certain caveats I would like otherwise have. I can screen off if we're doing that. So great, let's do that. Right. So one of the funny features on the third or style view that I take it you want to defend is as soon as you wake up, you're incredibly confident that the coin landed tails, even though you've gotten no evidence and so on and so forth. And you knew ahead of time this was going to happen. You knew exactly your evidence was going to be ahead of time, and you have this bizarre shift. So that's a prime facie bizarre seeming result. And you're describing another sort of bizarre seeming result that happens after you say update on learning that you're if each of these fissile is numbered, has a number between 1 and 1,000, and you learn that you're number 1 or something. I think that's the analog of learning that you're the first, learning that you're of a low birth rank. By the way, in the heads case, you also get the number 1.
Yeah, and sorry, just I guess the important difference between it and the traditional fission case is that the coin that determines whether the extra 999 people get created is flipped after the first person. Rather than at the start of the experiment. Right. Okay. So after learning you're the first person, now you know that the coin has not yet been flipped.
Okay, yeah. So I have a bunch of views on chance that I've written on. So and those views mean that difference you're describing, I think, makes no difference at all for the right way of understanding drift of chance. So
I actually agree with that. I think on the right theory, it won't make a difference. But I think like the intuition is even clearer if it hasn't been flipped yet. Or like, you imagine seeing this coin in front of you and it hasn't been flipped yet. And you're like, I know at 1,000, I've done some anthropic reasoning and I know at 1,000 to 1 odds or 1,000,000 to 1 odds or whatever, depending on how you change the numbers around, how this coin will turn out, just based on the fact that if it turns out one way, a lot of other people will get created.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's this question about how to, and I think even as far as deviation from chance stuff goes, they both have, in some sense, this implausible feeling deviation from chance. I mean, the way to get around that, of course, is to be a sort of double halfer, which I've also defended in my first view, though not one I'm really sort of happy with anymore, which would say, which should have you keep your credences with the chances no matter what. So you wake up and you're half a half, and you learn your number one and you're still half a half. So if you really want to keep the chance intuitions, then I think that's the way to go. Adopt something like compartmentalized quintillization. But then, so I think in this particular case, if we've got to be completely myopic, I think as far as folk intuitions go, that's sort of the most plausible view. But then you bite a lot of bullets when we start looking at other kinds of cases. And so likewise, in this particular case, if you look at the two views I take it that we're describing, so a sort of standard third view and a Lewisian halfer view, here we have a sort of local kind of bullet. So here's a kind of reasoning. So as far as like what sort of tiebreaker, what makes me, Chris, my heart of hearts, think that the go for a Lewis halfer view here. And I should say this is, again, I've defended two different views. One of them, which is a thirder view on one sort of way of thinking about things. So that half of me is happy with the third result. But that's boring. So I'm going to go with the other half of me who goes for like six.
There's an angel and a demon on your shoulder, and the angel is telling you to third, and the demon is telling you to half.
Sure, yeah, but they wear costumes, so they're very hard to tell apart. The devil or the angel. Yeah, so going for the half review. Here's one pretty plausible rule, and you can look at lots of sort of abstract sort of principles, but prima facie, you might think on plausible views, you shouldn't have something which sort of seems like, and it certainly has some caveats you want to sort of add here, but seems like a reflection violation for completely self-aware agents. Agents know exactly what the credences are going to be and how they're going to update and so on and so forth. So a sort of instance of that is, so that, this is von Frauen's reflection principle. Tells you, I realized to speak to some audience who may not know immediately what that is. It says basically that
I think everyone in the world knows about von Frauen's reflection principle. Even kindergartner. Probably it is worth explaining.
So your credence in a proposition should be equal to the mixture, the weighted average of the credences you think you'll have in this proposition in the future. So you can think of sort of various counterexamples, but they're basically counterexamples that come from cases where you're mistaken about your beliefs and or basically think you're going to be irrational in some way. And so, again, there's bits of details about how to spell this out precisely, but there are ways of sort of tweaking this such that you don't end up having those counterexamples. And it ends up being a sort of diachronic constraint instead of a synchronic constraint. But anyway, here's the kind of behavior that seems very strange. It seems very strange to know exactly what your evidence is going to be, have that evidence, the evidence you knew you were going to get, and then have your credences change and stuff. And that's something which is happening in the third position, say in efficient thinking beauty. You know exactly what your evidence is going to be. You know everything, and then you wake up and suddenly your credence in heads and tails is different, even though you haven't received any evidence, it seems, or you knew exactly the evidence you were going to get, and so on and so forth. one might think, hey, here's a nicer, here's this would be a nice thing. And yours doesn't settle it because sometimes we can't have nice things. That's the way it goes, right? There are lots of areas where see this in ethics, right? Utilitarianism has a lot of perks, but you got to bite certain bullets. Okay, you sort of bite the bullets and just go with it. But it would be nice if you could have a view which didn't have that, which only said that your credence should go up in a certain proposition if prior to the fact, we're assuming that you're appropriately rational and self-aware and not confused and so on and so forth. There's also some possibility of something coming about which would lower your credence in it in a way that sort of ends up appropriately offsetting things.
Yeah.
And the Lewis Haffer is in fact going to satisfy, you sort of formulate more precisely this kind of principle, is going to satisfy probably that sort of principle. So it's going to be the case that your credence in something only ever goes up for evidence that you're going to get and so on and so forth. If from your prior perspective, there was some evidence you could have gotten that would have made your credence go down.
Yeah.
So that's one sort of tiebreaker. And that's the reason I'm bringing up that particular one, because there's lots of arguments people have thrown back and forth, is as a autobiographical fact. That's one of the ones that's been felt especially compelling to me at the end of the day. There's lots of arguments. I'm like, do I even have intuitions about this anymore? I don't know. You're initially bringing up are things like after 15 years, like, boy, like my intuitions are shot. Like I don't even have them anymore.
Yeah, I'm still young, so I still have intuitions about things that are not just whatever my theory says about it.
Yes.
Though I mean, when my intuitions about I just have very SIA intuitions, so maybe I was from birth had intuitions that were shot by the theory. But okay, so I'll first describe why I don't find the double Haffer position tenable, even if we just restrain ourselves to the Sleeping Beauty, to the fission Sleeping Beauty case. I don't find double halving. Well, so first of all, I think when you make double halving, try to make a coherent theory out of it, it just ends up basically necessarily being compartmentalized conditionalization. There are some slightly technical reasons for that. I'm currently writing a paper called Against Anthropic Theory X, where I argue that any ultimate anthropic theory will look very much like either SIA, SSA, or compartmentalized conditionalization. And I think there's the least leeway for the compartmentalized conditionalization views. Like, the view will have to look pretty much exactly like compartmentalized conditionalization with only very small tweaks. And I think compartmentalized conditionalization is extremely false. I think one big problem for it is that it implies that you should just be almost certain that you're a Boltzmann brain, where the idea is that, suppose you observe the standard model in physics, some physicist shows it to you, says this is the standard model. Well, the prior probability of that being, we should probably explain what compartmentalized conditionalization is. Compartmentalized conditionalization, what it says is that upon having some experience, the relevant evidence that you update on is just that experience was had. So theories are likely or proportional to conditional on the theory, it being the case that someone would have your exact set of experiences. It doesn't matter what percentage of people have your experience or how many people. It's just what are the odds that someone would have your experience. Okay, so
yeah, or to study more, it's like conditionalization, just to put it a slightly different way. So the figure has two different respects. So standard conditionalization says, hey, here's how you should formulate your new credences. Take your old credences, rule out the possibilities incompatible with your evidence, and renormalize. So compartmentalized conditionalization effectively compartmentalizes, does this in two steps. So first, at the level of worlds, so complete qualitative ways the world could be, it says, basically do that. So set your rule out any worlds incompatible with your total evidence, and then renormalize your old credences. Okay, and now at this point, you have a bunch of sort of credence attached to each world. And how do you divide that up among centers? Well, now you sort of conditionalize again within each compartment. This is why I called it compartmentalized conditionalization when I proposed it. they're conditionalized again within each compartment. So you sort of look at your relative priors, or when you assign credences to the each center compatible with your evidence, and then again renormalize within each world, and then that's the sort of ultimate credence distribution you get from compartmentalized conditionalization. Okay, yeah,
right. So suppose a physicist, they show you the standard model, and the standard model, written out, it's kind of long, it has a bunch of weird symbols. The prior probability that that's the correct description of physics is ridiculously low. But the reason why we think it's the direct description of physics, even if you don't know the physics evidence behind it, is just that, well, if that's not the right theory of physics, the conditional probability that the physicist would show you this exact sequence of symbols is also ridiculously low. And it's low for exactly the same reasons, that it's highly specific. And so the two cancel out. So that's why, normally, if you're, an SIA or an SSA, or you can say, look, I'm confident that the physicists are right when they tell me specific things about physics that are true throughout the universe. But on compartmentalized conditionalization, all you need is a theory on which somewhere in the universe someone has your exact experiences. Well, there are lots of theories on which the universe is big and has a bunch of hallucinating Boltzmann brains, some of whom have that experience. And so those will just end up taking a much bigger slice of probability space than the highly small slice taken up where that specifically is the right theory. Right. Okay. So, and I think compartmentalized conditionalization.
Yeah. Let me just flag one assumption in that particular argument. Because again, I agree with you in the end. I recanted compartmentalized conditionalization. As far as that particular example, one of the implicit assumptions you're making there is that it's something like indifference within worlds, so that your prior in each Boltzmann brain is the same as your prior, say, in not. And that doesn't follow from the updating rule. So it could be, for example, that you assign very low priors to Boltzmann brains from the start and much higher priors to non-skeptical scenarios. If that were the case, you wouldn't get, just in the particular case you're describing, that kind of result.
Right. So I think, I mean, first of all, even if the argument doesn't get you global skepticism, it will get you local skepticism about every particular fact, right? So the scientists observe that the cosmic microwave background radiation is 2.7. And then they're like, well, if the universe is big, the prior probability that that would be the exact cosmic microwave background radiation is pretty low. But if the universe is big, like, someone would miscalculate it to be that. And so as long as the prior in a big universe where someone would miscalculate it is higher than the prior, I guess it has to be big enough to have someone with their exact experiences miscalculate it, then you'll end up with a really low probability in thinking that the measurement was correct. And the other thing is that, like, to get a Boltzmann brain, you don't need to have some, like, globally skeptical scenario. All you need is a big universe, and some Boltzmann brains will inevitably arise. And so as long as you think that the slice of probability space occupied by worlds that have, that are big enough to have Boltzmann brains hallucinating your experiences is higher than the highly, highly specific one with our exact standard model, then you'll inevitably get.
Yeah, sorry, just yeah. So this is weird, but sorry, David Bouley has defended recently compartmentalized conditionalization. So even though I'm not fitting, let me put on the hat of someone.
Okay.
So yeah, I completely agree with you what you're saying about Boltzmann brains, and I think there's lots of our plausible actual cosmological theories which, on plausible ways to think about them, will predict exactly that there will be tons of these things. Right. So that's I think it's scientifically respectable, plausible to believe that, yes, it's almost certainly going to be the case that there are going to be lots of Boltzmann brains, given certain popular cosmological pictures of the world. That said, the motivation for assigning different priors to different centered worlds within the same world, like, that doesn't follow from anything about the rule, and doesn't follow from anything about global skepticism or skepticism of other kinds of considerations one might have. One might just think, and there have been well-known famous epistemologists who have made claims that are effectively like this in slightly different contexts, that your credence should just be, the Boltzmann brain is going to have various beliefs on a certain picture of beliefs that are sort of mistaken about what the world is like. The embodied me does not have mistaken beliefs about what the world is like. And so one of the sorts of views which is floating around in the epistemological literature, this is not to defend it or attack it, but is that in cases like that, it's reasonable or rational or required or something to effectively assign a much higher prior to the possibility in which your beliefs aren't radically mistaken or largely mistaken. So somebody who is holding that kind of view, I think in compartmentalized consideration would say, we should think this kind of theory, we should absolutely think there are Boltzmann brains. But then when we compartmentalize and we're dividing up our credence in this world among the different centers, we should assign priors to embodied agents like ourselves that are much higher than priors to Boltzmann brains. And so when we divvy up our credence, a lot more of our credence ends up getting assigned to the embodied people like us than ends up getting assigned to the Boltzmann brain people. This is what I think a defender of compartmentalization.
Right. So I don't think that it'll. I don't think it has to hinge on like being non-embodied, right? So there are. Well, actually, sorry. I guess your response it would apply to people who aren't not embodied as well, as long as they're massively mistaken, right? But okay, so let's imagine that consider two hypotheses. So let's say my honest physicist friend, he comes to me and he says this is the standard model. Okay, and we're considering two hypotheses. Hypothesis one is that this is the actual standard model, and hypothesis two is that this is just a series of completely fake symbols, and my friend is just a complete joker, where he was trying to swindle me to believe this. Well, if the universe is really big, like someone's friends would be complete jokers, and so there would be some copy of me who finds themselves with friends with complete jokers, and look, I mean, the probability that this would be the exact standard model is ridiculously low, and there's no update that offsets it. And my friend being a complete joker, that doesn't result in global skepticism. So this kind of constraint on priors, you'll still just end up thinking that for like any particular local fact, probably you're mistaken about it, so long as the local fact is the sort of thing that doesn't vary throughout the universe and is highly specific.
Yeah, sorry. I certainly think there are objections. Yeah. What else along? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But so that's one problem with double halving, where I think it'll just inevitably look kind of like CC-ish, and then I think CC is very false. The other problems, I think, like, even if there was, like, just considering just the sleeping beauty with fission case, the double halving view starts to look bad for quite a few reasons. One of them is that it just does seem to violate Bayesian conditionalization, where so before learning your birth rank, you think to yourself, it would be really surprising. It would be it's a 1 in 1,000 chance event that I'd be the first person. If the coin comes up tails, well, if it comes up heads, it's guaranteed. And then you learn you're the first person, and you're like, okay, that would be how I assigned it. Really surprising on one hypothesis, really likely on the other. You learn it, your credences do not change. And that seems sort of suspicious. And so, I mean, first of all, there are like a few related principles it'll violate, where it'll violate this principle that just like, and it's tricky exactly to make it precise about how to formalize the updating rule. But after you learn something that's 1,000 times likelier on theory A than theory B, your credence in theory A goes up by a factor of 1,000 if you don't learn anything else. And it violates reflection, because if you know, okay, in 5 minutes you're going to be told that you're the first person. You're going to be told what your birth rank is. Well, you'll on average your credence will go and tails will go up, where either your credence and tails will go to 1, or your credence and heads and tails won't change. So I find that problematic. But I think what's even more problematic is this other cluster of results, which is so there's a case Mike Teitelbaum, I think, discussed.
You're absolutely right about the reflection where it applies just as well to compartmentalized condensation as to third-ring. That's absolutely right.
Yeah. So if so imagine, one person's going to be created, then a coin's flipped. If it comes up tails, then another person will get created, and then another coin will be flipped. It doesn't do anything. It's just flipped for the fun of it. And so you think to yourself, so one coin's flipped, one person's created, coin's flipped. If tails, another person's created, and then after that person, then another coin's flipped that has no effect. So you're created, you don't know if you're the first person or the second person. And you think to yourself, okay, what are the odds that the coin that will be flipped, like later today, will come up heads? And the answer that you get on the half view, on the double half view, I guess also maybe on the single half view, I don't know. I think is 5/8. And the reason you get that is you think, well, there's a 50% chance I assign to there being only one person. So that's 4 of the eighths. And then there's a 1/8 chance that I'm the second person and the coin will come up heads, because that requires 3 events of 1/2 probability, which are the first coin comes up, tails, you end up being the second one of the 2 people, and the second coin comes up heads. And so in total, you end up thinking with 5/8 chance that a fair coin that hasn't been flipped yet, that you're currently looking at, will come up heads. And I find that to be sort of alarming. I want my credences and fair coins that haven't been flipped yet coming up heads to be 1/2. And this gets even more troubling when you realize that, so like, you're either the first person or the second person. Once you learn which of the 2 people you are, you'll inevitably think that the odds of the coin coming up heads is 1/2. But so there are two phenomena. There are two things, A and B, and either A or B is true. If A, then I should have a credence 1/2. If B, then I should have a credence of 1/2. But your credence is not 1/2, and that seems very wrong. I guess the
violation.
Right. Yeah. It's a reflection violation, and it's a violation of the intuition that, like, it's a violation of the principal that your credence of the coin that hasn't been flipped yet coming up heads should be 1/2. The last kind of cluster of cases that's pretty similar is.
I should just flag that whether the principle is violated is going to be this super tricky thing. So I think it's not obviously a violation of the principle, because how to generalize a principle to apply to cases of self-locating beliefs is this really tricky thing. And I don't think there's a consensus about it. There's different stories one can tell, plausible stories, but it's also hard to sort of advocate one or the other without sort of begging the question. So
I think that. I think that's true. Sorry, so I should have been more precise. So in my one published paper on Anthropics, I lay out the principle that your credence in a future chance event should equal its objective probability if nothing about the world that you've observed so far is likely on the supposition that it'll turn out one way than another. And so it'll violate that principle, right? Because because nothing about the world so far is likely on the assumption that it'll turn out heads than tails. Whether it will come up heads or tails, you currently would be observing all exactly the same things. But so the last kind of cluster of cases that I find problematic here is, so so one person's created, then a coin's flipped, and if it comes up tails, 999 other people are created. Okay, so you're created, you don't know your birth rank. So as a double halfer, what you think is, the way you think, there's a 50% chance that I'm the only person, that I'm the one person and the coin will come up heads. And the odds that there's one person and the coin will come up tails is 0.5%. Sorry, that you're the first person and the coin will come up tails. Because the idea is that the 50% of credence space that's occupied by the tails worlds, your centered credences is split equally across the 1,000 people. So you're equally likely to be any of them. And so this ends up getting so for this reason, it produces that you ought to think to yourself, if I'm the first person then it's 1,000 times likelier that this fair coin that hasn't been flipped yet will come up heads than tails. So you don't just get thinking that coins are 5/8 likely to come up heads. You get the result that you know that if you're in some situation, then you end up thinking that a fair coin that hasn't been flipped yet will come up heads at any arbitrarily high odds. So it's problematic in the same way that single halving is. But then this gets an even weirder result, which is that normally if
Sorry, I thought we were talking about Lewis halving. Are we not talking about?
No, sorry. Okay, no, I'm talking about double halving, though I'll get
sorry.
to Lewisian halving in a moment. Right, so the idea is just, you haven't yet learned you're the first person, but because your credence in you being the first person given tails is only 1 in 1,000, you end up thinking, well, if I'm, right, based on your credences before learning that you're the first person, you think it's 1,000 times likelier that you're the first person and the coin will come up heads than that you're the first person and the coin will come up tails, which seems like a pretty bad result. If, they both predict, this ends up getting a result that you should think to yourself, if I'm the first person, it's 1,000 times likelier that the coin will come up heads than tails, which seems wrong. But then even weirder, after you learn that you're the first person, then you're back to thinking heads has a 50% probability of happening. So you think to yourself, if X then Y with probability N, you learn X, and then you don't think Y with probability N. And so that ends up being a sort of implausible result. I think. So that's why I think, even barring what they say about other cases, I'm pretty dubious about double halving. Sorry, I have stuff to say about single halving, but I realize I just said a bunch of things. So if there's anything you want to,
I'll confess that I don't find that last case you described to be super intuitively compelling. But maybe that's part of my sort of muddied intuitions, as I feel like in these cases, every view says implausible things, and so my intuitions here are So I'm just like, yeah, right. That's one of the three kinds of implausible things that one ends up having to say. I guess the third view seems just as bad, and it's the reflection violation stuff that ends up sort of tilting for the half of me that goes seriously diachronic.
The half for half.
The half for half, exactly. The Lewis half for half.
Right. So
the reflection thing, that's sort of the trump for that. But that's not. I'm not trying to convince you. I'm reporting.
Yeah. So I think, right. So the reflection thing is interesting. I guess, right. So I agree. Every view will have to say at least something weird. What I think is attractive about SIA is that it ends up that for the results that look weird at first, I find there tend to be independent reasons to think they're right. So there tend to be several converging lines of argument for thinking the SIA result is right, while the others just have to bite the bullet and have nothing plausible to say about it. Now, maybe this is obviously, a wildly controversial judgment, but
yeah.
So So regarding Lewisian single halving, so I think that I find it much worse to think that after waking up, I don't find it bad to think that you should think that the coin almost definitely came up tails. Just when you're clear, I think I find that intuition goes away when I think clearly about your centered credences across the people, right? So if you're okay, look, the odds that I'm the first person and the coin came up tails, let's suppose we're talking about the version where one person's created, then a coin gets flipped, and if it comes up tails, 999 other people get created. Well, when I think to myself, look, okay, the odds I'm the first person and the coin will come up heads equals the odds I'm the first person and the coin will come up tails. And the odds I'm the first person and the coin will come up tails equals the odds I'm the second person and the coin has come up tails, which equals the odds that I'm the third person and the coin has come up tails, ... And so then tails is 1,000 times more likely. I don't know, when I think about this, it doesn't seem so bad upon waking up to think, look, there are 1,000 times as many people if the coin comes up tails. So in some sense, it's 1,000 times likelier that I would exist. I don't find this to be much of a bullet. Maybe other people will, just reporting my psychology. I find it, but like I find it much less bad because then the result where the Lewisian Haffer, after learning the first person, becomes very certain about the results of the coin flip, or like in the Nick Bostrom case, with the lazy Adam case, where they become like, God creates one person and then doesn't tell them their birth rank, and then they discover that they're the first person. Well, now they just know that they won't have many descendants. And so if God resolves to, if they have any descendants, make them have a lot of descendants, then like, they just have like the safest form of contraception imaginable. And by reliably agreeing to procreate, unless a deer drops dead at their feet, they get these like psychic powers where they can make deer drop dead at their feet.
All right. This is supposed to follow for which view?
The Lewisian Haffer view. Sorry, I went through the steps a bit quickly, but okay. So the idea is, so God creates one person, or creates two people, I guess, and he says to them, I'm not telling you your birth rank, but here's the setup. There were two people who came to exist, and I made it so that if they had any descendants, I made it so that they had lots and lots of descendants, quadrillions and quadrillions of descendants, maybe Google descendants. And so, being non-SIAers, Adam and Eve think, okay, I think heads, the odds that we're the first two people are roughly, and that there are only two people in total, are roughly equal to the odds that there are just tons and tons of people. But given that we're the first two people, given that there are only two people, we have to be those two people. While given that there are tons and tons of people, it's super unlikely that we're the first two people. So then if we ever learn that there are two people, then we get extremely strong reason to think that that there will be no people after us. And then God tells them their birth rank. You two are the first two people. So now they're extremely confident that they won't have many descendants. That they won't have any descendants, because God made it so that if they have any, they'd have many. And so now, like, they have this very safe form of contraception where now they know they won't have any offspring. And if they adopt some policy where they reliably agree to procreate, unless just like a deer happens to drop dead at their feet by chance, or unless they, get a royal flush in a game of poker they're playing, they can be confident that they will get the royal flush. Now, it doesn't cause them to get the royal flush, but after resolving to do that, their conditional probability on that happening ends up being very, very high. So that if they're evidential decision theorists, then they have really strong reasons to do that.
Yeah. So, and maybe this sort of thing which doesn't pull you or not. So just to start fixing things up a bit. So, right. So by way of background, this is, I'm sure, background but I'll just say it out loud anyway. So, right. On the standard conditionalization picture, you got two norms: probabilism, your credence should be probabilistic at any given time, this chronic norm; conditionalization, this diachronic norm about how you should update. And that way we described earlier. So when you get to purely self-locating beliefs, it looks like conditionalization can't be right. And so a canonical example of this is you're staring at a clock. God gives you the super accurate clock. And you're looking at this clock and it says 9 a.m. And so you're now certain it's 9 a.m. And the clock ticks over to 9:01 a.m. It seems you now should be certain it's 9:01 a.m. and not certain that it's 9 a.m. But one of the mechanical features of conditionalization is that certainties are permanent. So that's impossible according to standard conditionalization. Okay, so that can't be the right rule. We have to replace it or modify it in some way. Now, there's various proposals. Here's one generally common feature among them. Not universally, but common feature among them is in cases where you don't have purely self-locating beliefs, the sorts of updates it gives you line up with standard conditionalization. It turns out that the results that standard conditionalization gives you, when we're not looking at purely self-locating beliefs, look pretty good. And there's other sorts of weird fringe cases, but yeah, prima facie, that looks pretty good. So in the case you're describing, we have Adam and Eve thinking about have a bunch of descendants. Any uncertainty they have about who they are, those aren't cases, at least as naturally thought of. Those aren't cases of where learning their birth rank or learning any of that stuff is a purely self-locating belief, it seems. For purely self-locating beliefs, you need a case where you have at the exact same worlds, the world's exactly qualitatively identical, you have different centers which are sort of evidentially equivalent, or maybe intuitively in the subjectively identical state. And in the natural way of thinking about the Adam and Eve case, we don't think that any of their descendants, whether they have any, are in exactly the same subjective state as Adam and Eve, such that they don't know which of those positions they're in. So those wouldn't be cases of purely self-locating beliefs. And so those wouldn't be cases where, well, the Lewisian halfer says anything different than the third or whatever. You just conditionalize. You effectively just conditionalize on worlds. And maybe have different priors assigned over worlds in certain kinds of ways. Again, and I know you don't like going this way. You have SIA priors, and that could lead to certain kind of assignments. But it's not clear to me from the case as you've described it that the Lewisian halfer is going to say anything different than a third or anything else.
Yeah, maybe. Right. So I think the Lewisian halfer, right. So let's say, in this case, if God prophesies or something that if Adam and Eve have any descendants, in total, there will be Google humans. So the SIA will think, upon being created, not knowing their birth rank, they'll think that the odds that there will be, assume that the prior and Adam and Eve having many versus few offspring are equal, right? So before learning anything, they're equally likely. So after so an SIA will think, look, I got created. Because there are I for all I know, I might be any of the Google people who get created if the coin. Sorry, I feel a natural urge to start sentences of this form with "if the coin comes up tails," but of course we're not talking about the results of the coin flips. If Adam and Eve have lots of descendants, and then they learn they're the first two people, which has a probability of 2 over Google. Right, that they'd be the first two, and so then the probabilities exactly cancel out, and then you end up getting SIA credences. Now, if you're a Lewisian halfer, I would think that before learning that you're the first person, you would think that. Sorry, before you learn your birth rank, you'd think that the odds of the first two people having many descendants is roughly equal to the odds of them having no descendants. And then your credence remains sort of nicely split. And then between the two, it starts out even. And then after.
So that's the part that doesn't strike me as quite right. Now, one can modify the case, and there's an interesting question about to what extent our intuitions change. But I think no, that the Lewis halfer is gonna compatible with Lewis halving is having priors which are exactly the same as you described as the SIA ones. Lewis halving, understood as sort of a predecessor conditionalization or shifted conditionalization, particular dynamical rule, puts no constraints on priors. Just tells you how to go from one time to another, given evidence.
Right.
How many priors you want? You can certainly.
Yeah, I was imagining that the prior, in them having many descendants would be equal to them in them not having any descendants. Right. So, for example, like imagine God, he has middle knowledge, and he flips a coin, and if it comes up heads, he creates two people who are psychologically disposed to have descendants and will give birth to in total Google offspring. And if it comes up tails, then he will. Heads, they'll be disposed not to have any offspring. Tails, he'll create people who are disposed to have many offspring.
Yeah. But take the people in question. You can set the priors however you like. So you can decide. They can be SIA-ish looking priors. I know that's not the version of SIA that you said you're advocating, but it's my updating rule, and I'm saying, okay, well, give me some priors to start with. So you tell me what those are. In this case, sorry, maybe just say a little bit of a side as to why these maybe the purely self-locating belief thing, I think is sometimes can be a slightly slippery thing to see. So just for your audience. So if you wake up and you don't know whether it's 9 a.m. or 9:01 a.m., your room is dark, maybe you can't see your clock, you're a cat, and you've knocked over your clock and unplugged it and something. So you have no idea what time it is. That is intuitively a sort of self-locating belief. You're sort of wondering what time it is. But that's not a purely self-locating belief. Why? Well, because of one possibility, you're waking up and you're thinking this thought. Here's a qualitative fact. You're getting up and you're thinking, I wonder if it's 9 a.m. And if you look at all the other clocks, ignore relativity, locate at the same time, then, it says 9 a.m. That's one possible world. Another one is you wake up like this, and as you're thinking that thought, all the other clocks read 9:01 a.m. So it's true that there's different centers, but these are different centers at different possible worlds. And it seemed to me, and I guess a lot of other people, that when you look at those cases where the self-locating beliefs are tied to qualitative differences in the world, they're not purely self-locating, that conditionalization actually sort of looks fine. And so most people say, yeah, in those cases, well, you can just conditionalize. You don't need to start getting fancy or weird in those cases. So in the case you're describing, it sounds to me like all the uncertainty you're talking about is uncertainty about, hey, like a birth rank, is uncertainty which each corresponds to a different way the world could possibly be. I could be the 8 millionth person. So the person who's having this subjective state and thinking this thought, I wonder which person I am, is the 8 millionth person. Or the person who's having that thought and having this phenomenal experience is the first person, or whatever. Each of those will correspond to a different possible world. And so Lewis Haffing isn't going to say anything interesting at all there. Lewis Haffing isn't going to, or shifted conditionalization, as I say, or predecessor conditionalization.
Yeah,
the conditionalization.
Right. So I agree that like the update, it construed as an updating rule is not going to say anything interesting. But like, I don't know, if I was thinking of Lewis and Ian Haffing as just like, sort of like the idea that in Sleeping Beauty, before you learn it's day one, then you should be at 1/2. And then after learning that it's day one, then you should be at 2/3 on the coin having come up heads, or the coin that will be flipped coming up heads. But so if that's your view, well, that may not like mathematically entail, well, like it may not be that the updating rule that you're applying entails something about it. Like this case is structurally just a very similar case where it's just like, there are two people and then they either have a bunch of descendants or they don't. And then the question is, do you start out by assuming that you're way more likely to be created in the world where they have a bunch of descendants? But I do want to discuss the point about reflection.
Sorry, let me say that the structurally very similar thing. It's like when I talked earlier about like, oh no, all it's being equal. It's like this is a perfect example. So I think that the half of me that's a proponent of that, you can say no, they're not structurally similar at all. They're completely different. They're completely different in the most important way imaginable. So just so you know, if you're wondering, hey, where are Wolfgang Schwartz and that half of me going to push back? They're definitely going to push back into that point. They're going to say, they're structurally similar in the same way as, me doing this motion and me saving a baby from the river are structurally the same hand motion. So just in one of them, I'm pushing off a cliff, and one of them, I'm saving a baby. What? They're similar in relevant respects. You can say, I get how they're similar in some respects, but they're not the relevant ones.
I mean, I guess so. Like, there is a coherent view that starts with the SIA credences in the Adam and Eve case, but that rejects it in the Sleeping Beauty case. But that just seems like the worst of both worlds, where in the Adam and Eve case, where it seems like you get the cost of both theories, where you both end up being really confident in how future chancy events will turn out, and you also sometimes end up with a presumptuous philosopherish result where you're like massively certain that a world is actual because it has more people in it. Yeah, I don't know. It seems like a sort of less tenable view. But I think, I mean, the same point can be made equally well with just the coin flip case that involves Sleeping Beauty with fission, and then the non SIA view will imply that like you should be massively certain after ordering you're the first person in the outcome of the coin. But okay, so I want to address the stuff about reflection. Yeah. So I think that's an interesting point. But I don't find SIA's violation of reflection. Well, so there are different ways of precisely formulating the reflection principle, and I think like the versions of it that SIA violates, I don't find problematic. So here's an analogous case, and I think this was originally given by Ruth Weintraub. So a coin gets flipped. If it comes up heads, you get put once in a red room, once in a green room, and then in a red room again. And if it comes up tails, you get put once in a red room, once in a green room, and then in a green room again. So the idea is that heads is red, green, red. Tails is red, green, green. So they're the same for the first 2 days, but then on the later day, they will be, you'll be at 2/3. Sorry. On the only difference is on heads means the last day you'll be in the red room. Tails means on the last day you'll be in the green room. So in this case, and each day you have no memory of the previous day, as is, and the days, the rooms look the same. Okay, so on even single halfers will generally think that if you wake up and you're in a red room, then you ought to think that at 2/3 probability that the coin came up heads. And because, heads predicts you wake up twice in rooms like that, tails predicts you wake up only once in a room like that. So heads predicts with 2/3 probability on any particular day you'd be in a room like that. Heads predicts with 1/3 probability. But that means that just if you accept that, then with certainty, you should think that on Sunday, you're taking a bet with 1/3 probability. On Sunday, you think that you think with certainty that on Sunday, you think that there's a 1/2 chance that the coin will come up heads, but you know that tomorrow you'll think it with 2/3 probability. And so I don't find this example to be problematic. And the reason I don't find this to be problematic is it seems like on the first day, you'll just have misleading evidence. The first day is such that you'll be in a red room, and normally being in a red room is likelier given heads than tails. But on Monday, it's one of the times when you'll be in a red room, whether or not it's heads or tails. And so in this case, you predictably update because on account of your ignorance about self-locating facts, you'll just be given misleading evidence the next day. But then I would give a similar diagnosis in the Sleeping Beauty case, where I just think, you'll be given on the first day you'll be given misleading evidence because your wake up on the first day occurs whether it comes up heads or tails.
So here's the reason why. So when I said I prefer the fission version, this is exactly sort of getting on why. So I'm happy to talk, for example, about the fission version of that case. One of the weird things about the Sleeping Beauty version you described is because that's one of the sort of classic counterexamples to, rightly so, to reflection. Like, you flip a fair coin, I see it land heads, and then you're going to erase my memory. So I'm confident that tomorrow my queens and heads is going to be a half. Reflection would say, so my queens and heads now should be 1/2. No. My queens and heads now should be 1. I just saw it land heads. Okay, right. So that's the kind of sort of information loss thing, which cuts the plausibility of reflection. So I absolutely agree in the Ruth Wardrop case that no one's going to think reflection applies to that case. But let's take the fission version. So there's no memory loss or anything. There's just fission. And you can imagine the analog, I guess, of what you're describing, where if it heads, you have, in both cases, you have 3 fissiles. But if it goes heads, then one's in a red room and 2 are in green rooms. And if it's tails, so I don't know if I'm matching colors in the same way you are, but on one outcome of the coin toss, there's one of them appears in a red room and 2 in
I think heads is double red, tails is double red, single green, tails is double green, single red.
Okay, good. That. So there you are. So what credences do you think you're going to have ahead of time? So I take it you're going to think, okay, if I see a red room, so you said heads, I'll probably have a credence that's higher in heads. If I see a green room, I'll have a credence that's higher in tails, but you're going to have to satisfy reflection. You're in this house. So I think that example trades on the memory loss stuff, which is exactly, and I think once we remove that doesn't apply anymore. You don't get any. So I don't know. I don't think that way replying to reflection worry works.
Right. Well, sorry. Oh wait, sorry. So we're not talking about. Sorry. Okay. So we're talking about the fission case where there isn't memory loss.
Yeah. So let's focus on the fission case. Yeah.
Okay. So I think in the fission case, I mean, the way I would diagnose it is that I don't. Well, so in the fission case, it's a bit more complicated because it's no longer the case that your credence predictably changes because your credence didn't previously. You previously didn't have a credence.
Well, it's fission. So you, in a sense, so the poor part of the fission is it is you, but yeah.
Oh, okay. So sorry. Right. So there's one you on Sunday, and then the coin gets flipped, and if it comes up heads, then you fission. Sorry, if it comes up tails, then just that's the only you, and if it comes up tails, then you fission into two different halves.
Oh, so sorry. I thought in the case you fission no matter what. Or maybe I misunderstand the case you were describing.
Wait. Okay. Describe the fission case as you understand it.
Oh, sorry. I thought the case you're describing was a case where you're going to be fissioned into 3 people no matter what. And there's just this variation of what color rooms you're put in. So if it's heads, I guess 2 are put in a red room and 1's in a green room, and just put up tails, 2 in a green room and 1 in a red room. Sorry, but I could have just misunderstood the case you were describing. Sorry.
Yeah, well, right. So it wasn't you weren't being fissioned. Or wait, let me think. So I was originally thinking of imagining the case as applying to Sleeping Beauty. Specific.
I was translating that into what I
did. Right. Okay. Yeah. Right. So then the fission case. So sorry. So describe the fission case as. Describe the fission case that you're talking about, where you think you get this violation of reflection.
Sorry. I was thinking you don't, but I was thinking that when assessing reflection violations and whether they're bad, look at the fission cases, not the memory loss cases. So memory loss cases, you're not in a good position to assess whether. Like saying, oh, well, look, in this memory loss place, reflection's violated, and that doesn't seem bad. Sure. But that's not the relevant kind of...
Right. Yeah. Sorry. I was asking, what is the case where SIA violates reflection in the non-memory loss case, in the fission case?
So assuming that we're thinking SIA, which will be a thirder position.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the case, depending on how we understand SIA and what we're adopting, but if we're assuming those go together, then in the third case, you have fission, Sleeping Beauty. When you wake up, your credence in tails is going to be 2/3. You know this ahead of time, even though you know exactly what your evidence is going to be. Your evidence is going to be E. That's all the subjects in question are going to get evidence E and wake up in a subjectively identical state, and so on and so forth. You know all this ahead of time, and you wake up and your credence goes from 1/2, or credence in heads goes from 1/2 to 1/3, or your credence in tails goes from 1/2 to 2/3.
Okay, sorry. So the idea of the case is you pre-exist the scenario, and then just if it comes up tails, a second clone of you gets created.
Or you fission into two people. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
I just try to avoid just to avoid. So this is weenie stuff, back end stuff, topics that I'm worried about that probably don't matter to you at all. But let's just talk in terms of fission. There's not
right. Okay. So you split.
Yeah.
You split into two people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Epistemic successors.
Right. So. Okay, and so sorry. Then the point is that your credence in tails later is 2/3, and you think the Weintraub case is different, where you fission into. Sorry. Why is the Weintraub case different?
So I took maybe I was misunderstanding this. I took the Weintraub case to be a case which showed that, hey, violations of reflection aren't so bad. And it was supposed to be a case which described, hey, in this case of memory loss.
Okay, so
you're going to have reflection violation. But I was like, yeah, cases of memory loss are like me having my memory erased as to the outcome of a coin toss. Everybody knows that's not a case where reflection holds, but that's not an escape clause in the Sleeping Beauty style cases. Because you can look at the fission versions where no memory loss is involved. I don't see any analog of Ruth Weintraub case there that makes us think that you shouldn't believe.
So what if the case is, so coin gets flipped. If heads, you fission into two people in red rooms and one in a green room. If tails, you fission into two people in a green room and one in a red room.
Yeah.
If they're one of the time slices of you is such that, or sorry, not one of the time slices. Like, that the person in the copy of you in the red room, they are going to be in their credence is going to predictably be 2/3. Whether and so, well, I guess, yeah. How's that case different?
So this is a case where your credence will be a mixture, or if you like, lie in the span of your future potential credences. So you're going to satisfy reflection. You're going to think, oh, look at my successors. My future credences are in, I don't know, in heads and tails are going to be lie in the 2/3, 1/3 span. And you know this ahead of time, and they are. It's not the case, like in the Sleeping Beauty case, that oh no, all of my future successors are going to have a credence of 2/3 in tails, even though my credence is 1/2 in tails now.
I see. Okay, yeah. So you have to take an average of the successors. Let's see. Okay, and if you take the average,
so there's so we don't have a counterexample. Well, there's no general reflection that just lie in the span, as opposed to a mixture. And there's a question about how you want to incorporate.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't see, and I'll have to think more about getting another case like this, but I don't see. I don't see what's wrong with violating reflection if the number of people is not constant across the times, right? So everyone agrees that it's fine to violate reflection if the number of views that there will be in the future will go down, right? So on average, I should expect my credence that I'm alive tomorrow to be higher tomorrow than it is today. Tomorrow it should be 1, and today it should be hopefully high, but not 1. And so if it can go change when it's going down, when the number of time, when like, some of the, there's not a one-to-one correspondence, some of the user are going to get eliminated. I guess I don't see why you couldn't violate it if the numbers go up, particularly if you adopt the core diagnosis, which is that, look, tomorrow you're going to have, like, tomorrow there are going to be more copies of you, and so the one who will be created, if the coin comes up heads, where there's only one person, that one will just have like misleading evidence, where that one happened to be the lucky one. In that case, I guess it doesn't seem so bad to violate reflection in this way.
Yeah, I mean, I think in cases of death of various kinds, that there's natural ways of extending reflection. And there's a couple options here, but there's natural ways to extend reflection such that it still seems plausible in those cases. And those refined versions of reflection will still be violated in the Sleeping Beauty fission style case. That's the short version, I think.
Well, but I think maybe you'd need some other way of refining it for fissions to get more people. Like whatever covers the fissions for more people won't necessarily cover the death case.
Oh, sorry. No, I agree with that. I agree that those are two distinct things.
Right. And I guess it does seem kind of analogous. One way, let's see, is this one way to extend reflection, and I'm just spitballing here, there might be a million counterexamples, is you think that that if there are if you're going to fission, if there are going to be more like more people who are you in the future, then your credence should be a function of the like odds ratio across your future selves credences in one world versus another world, right? So the idea is like, you look at the total like amount of credence that all your followers will have in some event in the future, and then you add those up, and then you on one theory, and then on another theory, and then your overall credence ends up being that divided amount. So like in the Sleeping Beauty problem, well, or wait, no, this doesn't work.
Well, it works for me, but I don't think it works. I don't think it gives the result that you're looking for. Yeah.
Yeah. Wait, sorry. Wait, I think I'm. Yeah, I think. Wait, let me think.
But yeah, sorry, but think about it. Sorry, this is not stuff one has to figure out on the fly. Yeah. I should say one interesting thing about you mentioned, and again, I have two halves of me. So what happened to me is a thirder.
Yeah, one that you're like the fission person. One.
Sadly, or like a fragmented mind. Yeah. But as far as all the cases being for 1/3, I think that's really not the case. So I think Wolfgang Schwartz has done a bunch of nice papers, but there's actually arguments and diachronic Dutch book arguments, and there's like just a bazillion arguments for predecessor canonization / shifted canonization. So just as far as the impression that all the arguments, the 1/3 has all these arguments and the other views don't. I think that's not the case.
Right. Of course, then we'd have to think about see how much force the different arguments have, because I mean there are some other arguments for the third or conclusion that I find have a lot of force. Yeah. So I guess with the third or with the kind of conditionalization, so maybe the principle would be it would go the other way. So like the odds ratio that the different copies of you should have is a function of like the pre-reflection odds ratio multiplied by the number of centers, right? So here, because there are two centers, then you think, look, your odds ratio on Sunday was 1-to-1. Now it's 2-to-1 because there are two centers on tails while one on heads.
Yeah, one could modify reflection in a certain kind of way to try to sort of build in something like SIA, but it doesn't feel like that's going to be super intuitively compelling to anyone. Like the intuitive reflection intuition is not being captured by that. That's just a weird. I think one way of getting around, and this is sort of, I don't think we necessarily have this in mind, but so he has this special reflection principle. Sorry, maybe you don't know. He has a special reflection principle and a general reflection principle. And the general reflection principle gets around stuff. I don't think this is his intent, but gets around stuff like this particular worry because it just says, instead of saying sort of your credence should be a mixture, where there something matters what your credence each of these possibilities are and stuff. And so in cases of fission where you're certain you're going to have multiple possibilities and they don't normalize, what's going to go on? General reflection just says your credence should lie in the span. So in cases of irrational, you're not, no matter what happens, you're not going to lose information and so on and so forth. Your credence should lie in the span that you think your future selves, future rational, non-information losing, alive selves should have. And in that case, in the fission case, if you think both selves have a credence of 2/3 in tails, then the span is going to be a point 2/3, and your current credence in tails is 1/2. And so, as far as, and I think the span one does still do a very good job of capturing the intuitive backing, the intuitions that are sort of underlying reflection. So I think maybe that's a natural way to go. You don't have to worry about exactly how to weight different fissiles and stuff because that's
I guess I find like I don't find there to be something. So when we already think that you have to make modifications to the just vanilla reflection principle to make sense of cases where the number of centers is decreasing over time, and when I think we can give some diagnosis of like where the update comes from, where the reason why the new fissiles update is that they're like, oh, this me exists. Then which when they take into account uncertainty about that is more likely given tails than given heads. I think I think overall, you'll get like then it doesn't seem so bad to modify the reflection principle in cases where the number of centers goes up, because I feel like you have like a principled reason where for any center who finds themselves existing, they've won the jackpot on one theory, while on the other theory it's more expected. And so it's not surprising that their credence will be more in the direction of the theories on which there are more centers. Now, I know, of course, this is like, sort of assuming an SIA way of thinking about it. But my thought is like, once you're in this SIA frame of mind, like this doesn't seem like an additional cost. It just seems like sort of like what the SIA would expect about the reflection principle. I don't know. So it doesn't seem additionally costly, especially when you compare it to the verdicts on the other side, where you end up being like massively certain about how fair unflipped coins will turn out.
Yeah, sorry. Just to separate two things. one sort of thing is, hey, all things considered, which view should we go for? Each of these views has various pros and cons. And so one might think, hey, all things considered, I want to be a thirder and buy SIA, and that's the package which appeals to me most. Whereas maybe these cons, but there are also these pros, and the other views have these other cons. Absolutely, right? That's the position we're in. So that's a totally fair judgment for somebody to end up in. A different thing is to say, hey, here's one of the possible weights for and against. We have this sort of reflection style intuition, or maybe a sort of diachronic version of reflection, or some tweaked version. Is that intuition captured by one of these views or another? So I think the worry I have about the sort of thing you're describing is I think what you end up describing isn't capturing just the reflection intuition at all. It's giving it up into saying, well, I can formulate a different principle, which my verdicts will satisfy, but it's not the reflection intuition. I mean, I think what I wanted to do, but the third half of me says, hey, no, this is one of the places where you bite the bullet. You say, yeah, you're right. The third kind of reflection intuition, and I absolutely have a story to say about that and stuff. But you're right. That's that's on my list of bullets to bite. Just as the other side have their list of bullets to bite. But saying that view doesn't violate reflection, I mean, so maybe you can come up with a cool way of spinning that, and maybe I just haven't, it hasn't grokked for me yet. So I'll just register that I worry from what you're describing that doesn't seem to me that what you describe is really going to capture the reflection intuition and save the third review, and vindicate the third review rather.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I will have to give more thought to exactly how to formulate it, because there does, I don't know, there like the fission case. I feel like there are going to be other similar cases that could be given where maybe we'll have to give up on the other kind of reflection principle. But yeah, I'll definitely have to give it a lot more thought. Yeah, sorry, and these are assuming that both of the people are you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess one worry is like maybe there can't, like, it's not obvious that there can be two people who are both me, like at the same time, both existing.
Yeah, good. So here's the stance on that. So this is moving over to so I mentioned these two very different ways of thinking about rationality. So epistemic rationality. And let me briefly say what that is, and then I can occupy one half and say, okay, something about that. One natural way to go, you realize that these self-locating problems, you start taking into account stuff like memory loss, whatever, is to go very sort of inside, to go for sort of internalist, synchronic kind of picture. So you might adopt something that, might adopt what I've called sort of prior conditionalization. You have something like priors at a given time. Something that these aren't your initial credences or something, but they represent something. There's an interesting question about what they are. There's different sorts of stories you can tell here. But basically, your credences at a time should be formed by your priors at that time and your total evidence at that time. So it's a synchronic constraint rule. It's not dichronic. It's telling you, hey, priors now, evidence now gives you these credences now. So it's sort of an instance of what Brian Hedden's called time slice rationality. So it sort of zooms in. Another way is to think, okay, now we really want to keep the idea of a diachronic updating rule and take that seriously. Looking for is a replacement for conditionalization that's diachronic and allows your credence, to go from 1 at 9 a.m. to 1 at 9:01 a.m. in an appropriately plausible way. That's the route that sort of shifted or predecessor conditionalization going. So there are sort of bona fide diachronic rules. Sorry, this is anticipation. Sorry, could you repeat the thing you said? But this is
yeah. Well, so my worry was maybe a scenario where there are two fissions that are both you is impossible because identity is transitive.
Good. So if you have a generally diachronic rule, right? So it's saying something like, at first glance, hey, your current credence should be formed by your prior credences and whatever. Okay, but what's the sense of your there? What's the relevant sense of sort of personal identity that's relevant to our diachronic rule? What's not clear is the same notion of personal identity that's relevant to, say, inheritance, or should you go to jail or not and get punished, or all the other stuff one might care about. So let's just say, okay, well, who cares whether it's the same as that notion of personal identity? Let's define. Let's say there's an epistemic successor relation. Let's just christen it epistemic successor relation. That's a notion of personal identity that's relevant by construction, by stipulation, to this sort of epistemic question. Now, it could very well be the case that on some intuitive sense, you think, oh, how can two different people later on be the same person? Maybe you have certain metaphysical numerical identity questions going in there. Sure. But let's just focus on epistemic succession. Can we have an individual who has two distinct epistemic successors? And you might think, and again, this will depend on details on what exactly you think the diachronic rule looks like. But prima facie, it seems totally viable to say you can certainly have a time slice or a center world, but has two distinct epistemic successors. Maybe they're not identical in the personal identity sense, but they're successors in the epistemically relevant sense. And so they should each update using the credence, the epistemic state of that earlier state. We look at a generally diachronic rule. And so
right, but then I guess maybe it doesn't seem so if you think that they're not the same person in the personal identity sense, but they are in the epistemic successor sense,
and they may or may not be. It's,
right.
We're not
right.
quietist about the personality question.
Yeah, but I think so. I think if it's not the same person in the personal identity sense, then there will be violations of this kind of reflection principle. Because, think about the credence that the person has in their successor in the personal identity sense, being their successor in the personal identity sense. Well, their credence in that is 1. But their successor in the personal identity sense, they only have a credence of 0.5 in them being the successor in the personal identity sense of the original person, right? Because they think that, if there's only one person who's the successor in the personal identity sense, well, they think there's only a 50% chance that they're the successor in the personal identity sense versus the other copy.
Yeah. Once we shift to thinking, okay, let's look at the relation that's relevant. If we think there are generally diachronic rules that's relevant to diachronic norms, then that notion of epistemic succession and epistemic successors and epistemic predecessors is going to be something you want to sort of uniformly use across diachronic norms. Maybe there's multiple diachronic norms. And so if we look at the diachronic extension of reflection, then the notion, when you say my future credence, that would likewise have to be the same epistemically relevant notion of my future credence. So we have to sort of uniformly swap those out with epistemic succession, epistemic predecessors.
But I mean, I guess,
and I think what you were describing is a case where it's like, oh, well, what if you have a sort of keep reflection pegged to some sort of metaphysical notion of succession, but keep conditionalization or updating rule pegged to a different one? I agree that those won't line up, but I don't.
Yeah. Wait. Sorry.
I think that's the intuition. The reflection intuition. The diachronic version really is an intuition about what updating rules should be like. And so it's concerned with the same notion of diachronic continuity. So it's whatever your diachronic updating rule is looking at. So I think there's a lot of pressure to say, okay, no, those are going to be the same, whatever they are.
Yeah, I might be misunderstanding, but I wasn't. So I was talking about, I was imagining that the updating rule was going to apply to your epistemic successors. But so then you ask your epistemic successors, both of them, what is your credence in the following proposition? I am the successor in the personal identity sense of the original person. And well, no, actually, never mind. Yeah, because then only half of them would be the successors in the personal identity sense. Okay, these are interesting. I'll have to give this more thought. We have been talking for about 2 hours. There's of course a lot more to be said, but and I'd be happy to go to talk more. But if you wanna 2 hours is a good amount of time. So if you wanna get going soonish.
Yeah, sorry, I probably do want to get going soonish, but all right, and I appreciate your talk. This is a fun conversation. It was interesting. Yeah. So, but you asked for a view on Anthropic stuff. So the view on Anthropic stuff was roughly permissivist. So you can have concrete views about, say, what you might say in the beauty case and so on and so forth, but also permissive in a lot of these other cases. So what should you say in these various cases? Well, there's lots of permissible options there. So that's a view which is not, you mentioned 3 views: compartmentalization, SSA, and SIA. Again, maybe there's ambiguity worries about exactly what SIA and SSA correspond to. But here's a 4th view, which is permissivism about that, which says, oh, a lot of these are rationally permissible.
Yeah. So I think, if you can show that SIA follows, ultimately will be entailed by certain very plausible principles, then it'll seem like maybe the other ones, the other ones won't be rational, at least to an ideal agent. Or the ideal agent, they'll see okay, I have to update in accordance with SIA. Yeah. Okay. So then probably makes sense to wrap up. Around now. But yeah, this has been a really interesting conversation. I'll have to give more thought to the reflection stuff. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on to chat. Yeah. Any last words? I assume you're not going to die, but any.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm good. Good talking to you too.
All right. Sounds good. Okay. I guess I'll end the recording now.